What if the oldest cities on Earth weren't built by humans at all, but reconstructed according to plans that came from somewhere else? What if every temple, every ziggurat, every precisely aligned foundation stone in ancient Sumer was actually a copy of something older, something that existed before the flood waters rose and swept away the world that came before? Well, tonight we're stepping into the silent ruins of southern Iraq, where beneath the sand and the centuries of accumulated dust, there are cities that shouldn't exist. Not yet, not when they appeared. These places emerged fully formed from the desert floor over 5,000 years ago, complete with sophisticated drainage systems, astronomical alignments, and architectural knowledge that seems to have arrived all at once, without the usual messy process of trial and error that characterizes human innovation. So before we descend into these ancient streets together, into the shadows of temples where priests once whispered prayers to beings they call the Anunnaki, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here, we explore the mysteries of the Anunnaki and the Sumerians through the lens of archaeology, ancient texts, and the questions that keep researchers awake at night. We create these long-form documentaries specifically for sleep, for that quiet time when the rational mind relaxes its grip and allows deeper questions to surface. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. What time is it for you? There's something wild about it, honestly. While you're winding down in New York or LA or somewhere in between, someone else across the world is just waking up, listening to these same old mysteries. The Sumerians believed time moved in circles, looping endlessly. Maybe they were onto something. Maybe we're all just spinning along different points of the same huge wheel. All right, it's time. Turn down the lights. Get cozy. Let the day finally start to melt away. We're about to walk together through cities that were already ancient before Babylon even existed, back when Egypt was still figuring out how to write, when the first pharaohs were just starting to dream about pyramids reaching for the sky. Our story starts in 1946. The world was still reeling from war, and everyone was scrambling to figure out what had been lost and what might still be found. An Iraqi archaeologist, Fuad Safar, got permission to dig at a site deep in southern Mesopotamia, a lonely mound about 12 miles southwest of Uruk. Locals called it Abu Sharin, but Safar had a feeling, from scraps of old texts and scholarly rumors, that this place was something bigger. Maybe it was Eridu, the first city if you believe the Sumerian stories, the place where civilization itself started, the spot where kingship descended from heaven. So Safar and his team started digging. They cleared away the sand and silence that had piled up over centuries. What they found still puzzles archaeologists. Under the top layers, beneath the ruins they could easily date, they found temple after temple, one stacked on another, reaching back so far that written records just run out. 18 temples all told, each one torn down and rebuilt right on top of the last, using the same layout, the same sacred geometry for over 3,000 years. Just think about that, 3,000 years of people worshiping in the exact same spot. Generation after generation, they didn't let the old temple crumble on its own. They took it apart on purpose just to build a new one in the exact spot, facing the same way, holding to a sacred pattern none of them invented. They were guarding something, protecting a memory, keeping faith with a design so old even they'd forgotten who started it. The oldest temple as archaeologists call it, dates back to around 5400 BCE. That's more than 7,000 years ago, before writing, before the first dynasties, before anything anyone would call Sumerian civilization. And even this ancient building wasn't just a shack or a rough shrine. It was planned, a central room for the cult statue, an offering table, an altar set up to catch the dawn. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. But here, where it gets strange, where the usual archaeological story just doesn't quite add up, who were they building for? When the Sumerian texts finally show up 1,000 years later, they're crystal clear about Eridu's importance. This was Enki's city, the god of wisdom, the god of deep waters, the patron of crafts and secrets. His temple here, the Eabzu, or House of the Cosmic Deep, was built directly over the primordial waters from before creation. This was the spot where fresh water rose up from the endless ocean under the earth, feeding the world above. The priests who served these later temples believed they were maintaining a structure that Enki himself had ordained, that the location had been chosen by divine intelligence for reasons humans could only partially comprehend, and they took this responsibility with absolute seriousness, rebuilding in exactly the same spot, following the same plan for millennium after millennium, long after the original reason had faded from living memory into myth. When you stand in the ruins today, when the wind picks up and sends sand skittering across the broken walls and crumbled platforms, there's a quality of absence that's almost tangible. Something was here once. Something that drew people to this specific point on the flat Mesopotamian plain and kept them coming back, kept them building and rebuilding, kept them faithful to a pattern they inherited but did not create. The temples grew larger over time as the settlement prospered, and populations increased, but the sacred geometry never changed. The orientation remained constant. The central sanctuary always occupied the same position relative to the cardinal points, as though the builders were working from blueprints that could not be altered, following specifications they dared not modify. American archaeologists from the Oriental Institute in Chicago later examined Safar's findings, bringing new techniques and fresh perspectives to the interpretation of these enigmatic structures. They confirmed what Safar had discovered and added new details that only deepened the mystery. The earliest temples showed no developmental sequence, no experimental phase where the builders were figuring out what worked and what didn't. The first temple already demonstrated complete mastery of the architectural principles that would govern all its successors. It was as though the knowledge had arrived fully formed, handed down from somewhere else, from some earlier tradition that left no trace except in the perfection of its execution. And there's something else, something the excavation reports mention but don't emphasize, perhaps because they don't quite know what to make of it. In the deepest levels beneath Temple I, before the first brick was laid, before the first offering was made, there are traces of even earlier occupation, not temples but something else. Hearths, post holes, fragments of pottery that don't match any known cultural sequence, evidence of human presence at this location stretching back another 1,000 years at least, possibly much longer, to time so remote that no cultural attribution is possible. What were they doing here, those earliest inhabitants before the first temple rose? What did they know about this place, and why, when the first permanent structure was finally built, was it a temple and not a dwelling, a house for a god rather than shelter for humans? The pattern suggests something worth considering, even if it challenges our conventional understanding. Perhaps the location came first, chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with practical concern, like water access, or defensive position, or proximity to agricultural land. Perhaps the temple was built to mark something, to remember something, to maintain a connection to something that had happened here in a time before memory. The texts that emerged thousands of years later from other Sumerian cities speak of Eridu in language that verges on the reverential. It was the first of cities, they insist, the place where order emerged from chaos, where civilization began under divine guidance, where those mysterious principles that governed every aspect of culture and society were first established and distributed. Before Eridu, the texts suggest there was only wilderness and wandering. After Eridu, there were cities and laws and writing, and all the things that separate civilized humans from the animals and the wild places. But the archaeological record tells a more complex story, one that doesn't quite align with the neat narrative of steady progress from primitive to sophisticated. The cities of ancient Sumer appeared within a remarkably compressed time frame, almost simultaneously across the southern Mesopotamian plain, Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, within a few centuries of each other. They all emerged with many of the same characteristics already in place: monumental architecture, writing systems, mathematical knowledge, astronomical observations, legal codes, bureaucratic organization. The usual markers of gradual cultural evolution were compressed into what amounts to a historical instant. It's almost as though they were all working from the same template, following the same divine blueprint, reconstructing according to plans that originated elsewhere. And according to the Sumerian texts themselves, that's exactly what happened. The gods, the Anunnaki, established the first cities. They assigned each city to a particular deity who would serve as its patron and protector. They taught humans the arts of civilization, the technologies required to transform the wild landscape into ordered agricultural estates, the knowledge systems needed to track the movements of stars and predict the flooding of rivers. And then, after the great flood swept over and destroyed what they had built, they helped humanity rebuild, guiding the reconstruction according to the patterns that had existed before. This is, of course, mythology. The academic consensus is clear on that point, and we should acknowledge it. These are origin stories, theological narratives meant to explain how civilization emerged and to provide divine legitimation for existing social hierarchies. Sumerians were engaging in what every culture does, creating foundational myths that connect their present reality to a sacred past, grounding their institutions in cosmic authority that transcends mere human invention. And yet there's something about the archaeological evidence that doesn't quite fit the tidy narrative of mythology serving purely social and political functions. The precision is too consistent, the knowledge too complete, the appearance too sudden, the texts too specific in their descriptions of what the gods did and how they did it, and why they chose these particular locations for their cities. What if we took the text seriously, not as literal descriptions of extraterrestrial visitors or genetic engineering projects, but as something else? What if they're preserving a memory, however distorted by time and retelling, of actual knowledge transfer, not from aliens, but from a human culture that came before, one that was destroyed by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, one whose survivors carried what they could remember to the high ground, to places like southern Mesopotamia, and began the long, difficult process of reconstruction. The end of the Younger Dryas period, around 9600 BCE, saw catastrophic climate change and massive flooding as ice sheets melted and ocean levels rose by hundreds of feet. Coastal populations around the world would have been displaced, their cities and agricultural lands submerged, their accumulated knowledge threatened with extinction. If there were centers of learning, of astronomical observation, of architectural achievement along those drowned coastlines, their survivors would have fled inland, carrying whatever they could save of their cultural heritage, and they would have tried to rebuild, tried to recreate what was lost, tried to preserve the knowledge so that future generations would not have to start from nothing. Could Eridu have been one of those refuges, one of those reconstruction sites? Could the 18 temples stacked one upon another represent not just continuity of worship, but continuity of knowledge, each generation doing their best to maintain a connection to what came before the flood. To keep alive the memory of a world that was lost, the Sumerian texts speak explicitly of knowledge that survived from before the deluge, of wisdom preserved through the catastrophe, of divine beings who helped humanity rebuild according to the old patterns. Perhaps they were describing something real, something that happened even if the language they used was the only language they had, the vocabulary of gods and divine intervention. We'll never know for certain. The deepest levels of Eridu remain largely unexcavated, the water table too high, the mud brick too fragile, the political situation too unstable for the kind of extensive investigation that might reveal what lies beneath Temple I, beneath those enigmatic traces of even earlier occupation. Perhaps someday, when the circumstances allow, archaeologists will return and dig deeper, and perhaps they'll find something that clarifies the mystery rather than deepening it. But for now, in this moment, as you feel yourself beginning to relax, beginning to drift, let your mind rest with the image of those 18 temples rising one after another across 3 millennia, each generation faithfully rebuilding in exactly the same spot, maintaining a pattern they inherited from ancestors, who inherited it from their ancestors, who inherited it from someone, somewhere, at the very beginning, before written history, before civilization in the sense we usually mean it, in a time when the world was different and the gods, whatever that word really meant to them, walked among humans with less distance than they would later maintain. The wind changes direction, and suddenly we're heading north, skimming over the desert toward another city and another puzzle. The old city dedicated to the moon god Nana, rises out of the flat plain. That ziggurat still stands, at least partly, and even as a ruin it's hard to miss. Back in 1922, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley started digging here. His work caught the world's attention, and honestly, people are still arguing over what he found. Woolley stood out. He was careful, patient, almost obsessively precise. He wasn't just chasing after treasure to ship off to some distant museum. He took his time, digging layer by layer, recording everything. He wanted to know how the city changed over time, who lived there, how it all fit together. Then, under the royal tombs and all those official buildings and houses, he stumbled onto something strange. There was this thick, clean layer of river silt, almost 3 meters deep. No pottery, no ash, nothing at all to show people had ever been there. And under that mud, the remains of an older city, buried, crushed, left behind. The thick silt split the old city from the new, like a wall made of river mud. Woolley, maybe jumping the gun a bit, told the press he'd found proof of the biblical flood, Noah's deluge, the disaster that supposedly wiped out the world. The newspapers ate it up. "Archaeologist finds Noah flood," the headlines screamed. Woolley became a celebrity, but later researchers got a lot more cautious about his claims. Here's the real story with that flood layer. Archaeologists have found similar deposits at other sites in Mesopotamia, but the layers don't all match up in time. Ur's big flood happened around 2900 BCE. Over in Kish, you get a flood layer from about the same era. But at Uruk, the disaster evidence comes from a different time completely. Eridu, multiple floods, different periods. So it looks like the Tigris and Euphrates would break their banks every so often, flooding the plain, wrecking cities, and forcing people to start over. But there's no single, epic flood that hit everyone all at once. So what did Woolley actually find? Most likely, he uncovered signs of one particularly brutal flood that destroyed around 2900 BCE. When people finally returned, they rebuilt on top of several meters of mud, right over the bones of the old city. For those survivors, after the waters finally drained away, it must have looked like the end of the world. The Mesopotamian plain is so flat, it just goes on forever. If the rivers flood, water covers everything. And when that happens, it feels like the whole world has drowned. In their minds, it probably was a universal flood. That's why these flood stories matter. The Sumerian flood myth, tied to the cities of the Anunnaki, is rooted in real trauma. These disasters happened over and over. Whole generations grew up hearing about them, living through them. The stories layered into memory, got bigger and more dramatic, until they became the Great Flood, the dividing line between before and after, the day the gods wiped out humanity but let one good man survive by building a boat. The ancient texts talk about Ziusudra or Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, depends on which story you pick, as king of Shuruppak when the flood hit. Shuruppak was real. Archaeologists have found it, and sure enough, there's flood damage in the ground. The texts say that after the flood, kingship came down from heaven again, but this time to Kish, not Eridu. That's a big shift in power and religious meaning. And Kish, as it turns out, also shows major flood evidence right around then. So the myth and the archaeology, they're tangled up together. Real floods happened. Cities were wiped out and rebuilt. And on top of that, people spun stories, turning disaster into legend, turning rivers into the hand of angry gods. Over generations, the memory of those floods mixed with theology, and the stories got retold until they felt eternal, like something that happened outside of time, not just history but sacred truth. But what about the cities themselves? What about the physical structures that were destroyed and rebuilt, the temples and ziggurats that rose? Again from the flood silt, when Woolley excavated the great ziggurat of that massive stepped pyramid dedicated to the moon god Nana, he discovered something fascinating about its construction. The core of the structure, the oldest part buried within later renovations and expansions, dated to the early dynastic period around 2600 BCE. But it had been built according to a plan that showed complete mastery of architectural and engineering principles, with no evidence of experimental development or gradual refinement. The ziggurat's foundation was laid out with precise astronomical alignments, its corners oriented to the cardinal points with an accuracy that required sophisticated surveying techniques. The structure rose in 3 receding tiers, each one smaller than the one below, creating the stepped pyramid shape that would become characteristic of Mesopotamian religious architecture. At the summit stood a shrine, a small temple, where the god was believed to descend from heaven to meet with chosen priests and receive offerings from humanity. The entire design was not just monumental but symbolic, a cosmic mountain connecting earth to heaven, a stairway between the human realm and the divine, and the texts make clear that this symbolism was intentional, that the ziggurats were understood as literally providing a meeting place where gods and humans could interact, where the boundaries between the mortal and immortal realms became permeable. The Sumerian word for ziggurat can be translated as to build high, but it's deeper. Connotations involve elevation in a spiritual sense, lifting the earthly toward the heavenly, creating sacred space that partook of both domains. Now, here's what keeps researchers puzzling over these structures late into the night. What makes them wonder if there's something more to the story than we've yet understood? The sophistication appears too early. The knowledge seems to arrive fully formed. There's no clear developmental sequence showing how the Sumerians figured out how to build on the scale, how they learned the mathematics required to calculate load-bearing capacity and ensure structural stability, how they mastered the astronomical observations needed to achieve precise alignment. The ziggurats just appear in the archaeological record around 2600 BCE. Already perfected, already incorporating principles that wouldn't be formally rediscovered and codified until much later in human history. It's as though the builders were working from existing plans, following specifications handed down from an earlier time, reconstructing according to templates that survived from before the flood in some form. perhaps in oral traditions, perhaps in fragmentary texts, perhaps in the training of specialized priesthoods who preserved technical knowledge. Across generations, the Sumerian texts themselves support this interpretation, describing the ziggurats and temples as restorations of what existed before, as reconstructions of structures that the gods had originally established. In the first cities, the word they use most frequently in building inscriptions is not create or innovate but restore, rebuild, return to its original state. Every king who raised a temple or repaired a ziggurat made sure to record that he was acting in accordance with ancient plans, following the designs established by the gods in primordial times. This isn't just religious propaganda or royal boasting. It reflects a genuine cultural orientation toward the past, toward preservation rather than innovation, toward maintaining patterns established by divine authority rather than experimenting with new approaches. The Sumerians saw themselves as inheritors of knowledge, not inventors of it. They understood their civilization as built on foundations laid by the gods, by the Anunnaki who came before and taught humans how to organize society, how to cultivate the land, how to build cities that could endure. And if we take seriously the possibility that the gods might be a mythologized memory of actual knowledge transmission from an earlier human culture that was destroyed by rising sea levels and climate catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age, then this orientation makes perfect sense. The survivors would have been trying to preserve what they could remember, trying to reconstruct what was lost, trying to maintain the techniques and practices that had allowed their ancestors to achieve things they couldn't quite replicate but desperately wanted to preserve. Each generation would have passed down what they knew to the next, along with the injunction to keep it pure, to not change it, to follow the old ways exactly, because changing the pattern might mean losing something essential, losing some piece of knowledge that you didn't even know was important until it was gone. Better to maintain the tradition precisely as received, even if the original meaning had been forgotten, even if the practical application was no longer clear. Keep the knowledge alive. Keep the connection to the past intact, and perhaps someday understanding would return. As you feel yourself sinking deeper now, deeper into rest, into that space where questions don't demand immediate answers but can simply float and drift like clouds across an endless sky, let your mind rest with the image of those ancient builders. See them laying foundation stones according to plans they inherited but did not create, orienting corners to catch starlight that has been traveling toward Earth since before their cities existed. Watch them mixing mud and straw for bricks, millions upon millions of bricks, each one hand-formed and sun-dried, each one placed with care in walls that would stand for millennia. They worked in the blazing heat of Mesopotamian summers and the surprising cold of winter nights. They labored their entire lives on projects they would never see completed, knowing that their children and their children's children would continue the work, would carry on the great task of building and rebuilding, maintaining and restoring, keeping faith with a pattern that stretched back to the beginning, to the time when the gods walked on earth and taught humans how to transform the wilderness into gardens, how to channel rivers for irrigation, how to raise temples that would stand as eternal testimony to the covenant between heaven and earth. The moon rises over the ruins of Ur tonight, just as it rose 5,000 years ago when the ziggurat was new, and the priests climbed its stairs to make offerings to Nana in his shrine at the summit. The same moon, the same stars wheeling overhead in their eternal dance, the same questions echoing across the centuries. Who were the Anunnaki? Where did they come from? Where did they go? And what did they leave behind in these cities of clay and memory, these monuments to something that was lost and then partially remembered? The wind whispers through broken walls, and if you listen carefully, if you let yourself drift in that space between waking and dreaming, you might almost hear them, the voices of ancient priests chanting in a language no living person speaks, the sound of workers singing as they haul stones and mix mortar, the silence that falls when the gods depart, when the cities are left to humans alone, when the direct connection to heaven is severed, and all that remains are the buildings and the texts, and the memories of a time when things were different, when the boundaries between earth and sky were less fixed, when the Anunnaki moved between their celestial dwelling and their earthly cities with ease, with purpose, with plans they left partially fulfilled, waiting for a return that the texts promised would someday come. But that's a question for another time, another layer of the mystery. For now, let yourself rest in the peace of these ruins, in the silence of stones that have stood for 5,000 years and will stand for 5,000 more, patient witnesses to human dreams and divine departures, to floods that destroy and knowledge that survives, to cities that fall and are rebuilt and fall and are rebuilt again, in an endless cycle that mirrors the seasons and the stars, that echoes the very rhythm of existence itself. Rest now. The ancient cities will still be here when you wake, still holding their secrets, still waiting for someone to understand what was really built here, and why and by whom. The journey continues now, deeper into the desert, deeper into time, as your breathing slows and deepens, as the tensions of the day begin to release their hold on your body. Let your mind drift with me to another city, another mystery carved into the dust of southern Iraq. Uruk rises from the plain like a memory of power, like the ghost of ambition made manifest in mud, brick, and stone. This was the city that redefined what a city could be, that pushed the boundaries of human achievement so far that later generations could barely believe what their ancestors had accomplished here. When German archaeologists first began systematic excavation at Uruk in 1912, when they started peeling back the layers of sand and collapsed walls and accumulated silence, they found something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the development of civilization. The city was massive, covering nearly 6 square kilometers at its height around 2900 BCE, housing perhaps 50,000 people, maybe more. But what struck the excavators wasn't just the size, it was the sophistication that appeared so early, so completely, without the usual archaeological evidence of gradual development and refinement. Uruk seemed to leap fully formed into existence around 4000 BCE, and within a few centuries it had monumental architecture, complex administration, long-distance trade networks, and most revolutionary of all, writing. The invention of writing, or perhaps we should say the appearance of writing, happened here in Uruk around 3400 BCE. The earliest tablets are administrative documents, records of economic transactions, lists of goods delivered and distributed, inventories of livestock and grain. They're not literary masterpieces, or religious hymns or historical chronicles. They're bookkeeping, the mundane stuff of bureaucratic management, but they represent something profound, a cognitive revolution, the externalization of memory and thought into marks on clay that could outlast the human mind that created them. And here's what troubles scholars when they examine these earliest texts. In the quiet of museum archives, when they run their gloved fingers over incised surfaces that haven't been touched in 5,000 years, the writing system doesn't show the kind of experimental development you'd expect from a new invention. The signs are already standardized, already capable of representing complex ideas, already organized into a coherent system that hundreds of scribes could learn and use consistently. It's as though the basics were worked out elsewhere, or earlier in some context that left no trace, and what we see at Uruk is the system, already in practical application. In the 1920s and 30s, a group of American scholars from the University of Pennsylvania teamed up with German researchers to dig into thousands of these early tablets. They cataloged them, snapped photos, and tried to wrap their heads around the complicated system that needed such obsessive record-keeping. What they uncovered was wild. An economy run straight out of the temple of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. This wasn't just a place for prayers and offerings. The temple ran the show for the whole city's economic life. This place owned enormous farms. It put thousands of people to work across all sorts of crafts. The temple managed huge herds of sheep, goats, cattle. Workshops churned out textiles, pottery, metalwork. They even ran trade missions, sending people out across deserts and mountains to haul back timber, stone, metals, anything you couldn't dig up from the mud of Mesopotamia. And they wrote everything down. Every trade, every delivery, every bit of it, carved into clay tablets and stashed in archive rooms, where scribes could pull them out if anyone started arguing about numbers. It's honestly a bit mind-boggling to see this level of organization so early in history, with nothing obvious leading up to it. Some researchers start to wonder if Uruk picked up these administrative tricks from somewhere else, from a civilization we haven't found yet or one that vanished before it could leave much behind. Even the Sumerians seem to think their knowledge dropped out of the sky, straight from the gods, rather than something they worked out for themselves. Right in the middle of Uruk stood the Ina, the House of Heaven, the temple complex for Inanna. When archaeologists dug into this sacred ground, they kept finding layers and layers of massive buildings, each one bigger and grander than the last, reaching all the way back to the city's beginnings. These weren't just simple shrines. They were raised up on huge platforms above the city, with wide staircases leading up, the walls sparkling with thousands of colored clay cones pressed into the mud bricks, making patterns that must have lit up in the morning sun. Building all of this took a crazy amount of labor. We're talking millions of mud bricks, each one shaped by hand out of clay and straw, dried in the sun, hauled to the site and stacked up, layer after layer, until the buildings towered over the plain. Just keeping that operation running, feeding everyone, scheduling the work, making sure the walls didn't collapse, demanded a level of organization that, according to the usual story, shouldn't have existed yet. But it did. You can see it in the ruins, the way the walls line up perfectly, the careful proportions, the way the buildings connect to the stars. Inanna was the goddess of Venus, and her temple lined up so you could track Venus as it showed up as the morning or evening star, following that 8-year cycle the Sumerians knew about and recorded with real precision. Pause for a second. Let yourself settle, breathe. Imagine standing there, right at the foot of Inanna's temple at dawn. The first sunlight catches those colored cones in the wall. Priests and priestesses begin their rituals, their voices rising in a language that feels ancient, like water running over stones, or wind sliding through reeds, or maybe just the first words people ever spoke. The old stories say Inanna herself came down to her temple here, not as an idea, not just in spirit, but actually, physically, walking down from the sky to this exact spot. The Sumerians built their temples to make that possible, to turn these places into doorways where gods and people could meet, where the line between the worlds got thin. Inanna was one of the most complex deities in the Sumerian pantheon. Simultaneously, the goddess of sexual love and violent warfare, of fertility and destruction, of the life force in all its creative and destructive aspects. Her myths describe her as ambitious, passionate, sometimes cruel, always powerful. She challenged the authority of other gods, descended to the underworld and returned, seduced and betrayed, fought and loved with equal intensity. She was, in other words, portrayed with psychological depth and complexity that feels less like abstract symbolism and more like the characterization of an actual person, someone who could be understood and related to even if she couldn't be controlled or predicted. The famous Uruk vase, discovered in the Ina complex and now housed in the Uruk Museum in Baghdad, depicts what appears to be a ritual procession bringing offerings to the goddess. The carved scene shows worshippers carrying baskets of fruit and grain, leading animals for sacrifice, approaching a figure who must represent either Inanna herself or her high priestess. Behind her stand symbols of her power, the reed bundles that mark temple doorways, the sacred storehouse where the community's wealth was kept, the architectural elements that defined sacred space. But what strikes modern viewers about this ancient artwork is how transactional it appears, how much it looks like an economic exchange. Rather than purely spiritual worship, the offerings are abundant, carefully detailed, obviously valuable. The procession is formal, organized, ceremonial in the way that official state occasions are ceremonial. This was the goddess receiving tribute from her city, accepting the products of human labor in exchange for protection and blessing and continued fertility of fields and flocks. The relationship between Inanna and Uruk, between the goddess and her city, was understood as reciprocal. She provided divine power and favor. The city provided material support and worship. Each had obligations to the other, and the temple economy existed to manage this cosmic exchange, to ensure that the goddess received what was due to her and that the city received what it needed in return. When we examine the temple inventories that survive on clay tablets from Uruk and other Sumerian cities, we find lists of objects that the texts describe as belonging to the gods, as being held in trust by the temples, but ultimately owned by divine beings who might someday return to claim them. These inventories include statues and jewelry and fine garments, all things we might expect, but they also list items that are harder to interpret, objects described with terms that don't have clear modern equivalents, things that sound almost technological in their descriptions. There are references to objects that shine or emit light without fire. There are mentions of stones that speak or sing. There are descriptions of weapons that the gods used in their battles with each other, weapons that could strike at a distance, that could destroy walls or fell armies. The academic interpretation treats these as mythological embellishments, as symbolic descriptions of divine power expressed through metaphorical objects that never literally existed. But what if we entertain, just for a moment, just as a thought experiment as you continue to relax and drift, what if some of these descriptions preserve distorted memory of actual advanced technologies, not alien spacecraft or ray guns, but the achievements of a sophisticated human culture from before the flood, a culture that had developed capabilities we're only now beginning to rediscover. Technologies for generating light, for acoustic phenomena, for weaponry, more advanced than bronze spears and arrows. The texts describe the me, those fundamental principles or powers that governed civilization, as being stored in the temples, kept in special chambers, guarded by priests and priestesses who understood their importance. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, when the goddess steals the me from Enki's temple in Eridu and transports them to Uruk, the text says she loads them onto her boat of heaven and sails away before Enki can stop her. The me are described as discrete objects, things that can be moved from place to place, that enable specific capabilities in whoever possesses them. What were they really? Were they tablets containing written knowledge? Technical manuals for various civilizational technologies? Were they objects that embodied certain principles, tools, or devices that enabled those who understood them to perform specific functions, or were they, as mainstream scholarship argues, purely conceptual abstract principles, personified in mythology as physical objects, because that was the only way ancient people could think about institutional knowledge and cultural practices? We can't know for certain, and perhaps the answer lies somewhere between. Perhaps the me were real archives, real collections of knowledge inscribed on tablets or encoded in symbolic objects, and the myths that describe them being stolen or distributed or guarded are dramatized versions of actual conflicts over who controlled knowledge and who had access to the sacred wisdom that made civilization possible. As your mind drifts now, as thoughts become looser, less tethered to waking logic, let yourself imagine those temple storerooms. See the clay shelves lining the walls, supporting tablets organized by subject, by date, by importance. Smell the dust and the faint ghost of ancient incense. Feel the cool air in these interior rooms where the desert heat never fully penetrates, and imagine priests moving through this darkness, carrying oil lamps, searching for specific texts, consulting the accumulated knowledge of generations, preserving the wisdom that must not be lost, that must be passed on intact to those who come after. Let's drop into Lagash, a name that doesn't ring out like or Uruk, but if you're interested in how the Sumerians thought about divine knowledge and architecture, this place grabs your attention fast. The ruins sit about 25 miles north of Uruk. French archaeologists dug deep here in the late 1800s and early 1900s, pulling out some of the best clues we've got about Sumerian thinking. Now Gudea, you might have heard the name, maybe not. He was Lagash's star ruler, and he really leaned into temple building. This guy ruled from around 2144 to 2124 BCE, smack in the Neo-Sumerian period, and he left behind statues and inscriptions full of details about his projects. He either built or fixed up at least 15 temples, and he didn't just brag about it. He wrote down exactly how it happened. Here, where it gets interesting. Gudea's records say that Ningirsu, Lagash's patron god, came to him in a dream and handed over the temple's blueprint, literally, a tablet of lapis lazuli with the whole plan carved into it. Not just build a temple, but the whole thing. Measurements, layout, which way it should face, every tiny detail. Of course, the dream was a little cryptic, so Gudea turned to Nanch, a goddess known for her dream-reading skills. She broke it all down for him, explained the symbols, made sure he got the message right. Most historians chalk this up to royal PR, Gudea just doing what kings always did, claiming the gods backed his play, that he was only following orders from above. And sure, that's part of it. Every king wanted people to believe he'd been picked out by the gods. But the thing is, Gudea doesn't stop at the usual "the gods approved my temple" line. He says the gods handed over real, detailed designs, down to the measurements, the materials, the orientation of the building. He talks about needing help to make sense of it all, calling in engineers and craftsmen, figuring out where to get the right stones, how to handle the tricky parts. These aren't just pious boasts. They read like actual construction reports, just with a supernatural spin. There are still plenty of Gudea statues around. Most show him as this humble, devout figure, sometimes clutching a tablet with the temple's floor plan right there on his lap. There's a famous one in the Louvre. He's holding a tablet with a ground plan, complete with notations that modern architects can actually read. It's not just art. It's a pretty solid technical drawing. Now here's the question that hangs over all of this, the one archaeologists love to kick around after hours. Where did the knowledge come from? Gudea ruled at a time when Mesopotamia was buzzing with skilled builders and architects. Obviously, people knew how to build, but Gudea swore the real source was divine. Ningirsu laid out the plans, humans just carried them out. If you take seriously the idea that the gods might really mean the memory of lost knowledge from an earlier, maybe more advanced civilization, then Gudea stories start to sound less like myth and more like a veiled record of knowledge being handed down. Maybe there really were ancient tablets, tucked away in temple libraries, packed with technical know-how. Priests could have studied them, believing it all came from the gods. Or maybe it was all about careful training, masters passing down secrets to apprentices, always framing it as sacred wisdom from the Anunnaki, the legendary founders of civilization. Most of Gudea's temples are gone now. Rain, wind, and time have eaten away the mud brick walls. But under the corners of the old foundations, archaeologists have found deposits, hidden chambers with tablets describing the construction, prayers for the gods' protection, messages to the future. They feel like time capsules, tucked away in hope that someone someday would find them and remember. They're pleased to keep the link alive, to hold on to the divine knowledge that, in their eyes, made civilization possible in the first place. As you sink deeper now into rest, into the soft darkness behind your eyelids, let your breathing match the rhythm of ancient ritual, the slow chants that filled temple courtyards at dawn, the measured pace of priests processing through sacred spaces, maintaining patterns that were old when Gudea was young, that stretched back to Eridu and beyond, too. The very beginning, when the first temple was raised to mark the place where earth touched heaven. North now to Nippur, the religious heart of ancient Sumer, the city that was never a political capital, but that held spiritual authority, that transcended any individual ruler's power. Every king of every Sumerian city had to make pilgrimage to Nippur, had to receive legitimation from the priests of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, the lord of the air, the god who separated heaven from earth. At the beginning of creation, Nippur occupied a unique position in the sacred geography of Mesopotamia. It was located in the center of the land, equidistant from the northern and southern extremes of Sumerian territory, positioned at what the ancients called the bond between heaven and earth, the axis, where the celestial and terrestrial realms intersected most perfectly. The city's main temple, the Ekkur or mountain house, was understood as quite literally connecting the three cosmic realms, heaven above earth at its base and the underworld beneath. American archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania conducted extensive excavations at Nippur between 1889 and 1900, and then again in multiple campaigns throughout the 20th century. What they discovered was a city that had been continuously occupied and continuously sacred for over 6,000 years, from the earliest Sumerian periods through Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, and even into early Islamic times. Layer upon layer of temples, built and rebuilt on exactly the same spot, maintaining the same orientation, preserving the same sacred geometry. Across millennia of cultural and political change, the Ekkur temple complex dominated the city, its ziggurat rising in massive tiers toward the sky, visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. Pilgrims approaching from any direction would have seen it first, this mountain of mud brick ascending from the earth, this stairway to heaven where Enlil dwelt in his shrine at the summit. Texts describe the god descending to this shrine on specific festival days, coming down from his celestial palace to receive worship, to hear petitions, to dispense justice, to renew the cosmic order for another year. But Nippur's real treasure, from an archaeological perspective, wasn't the temple itself. It was the library, or rather multiple libraries, archive rooms attached to various temples and administrative buildings. Rooms where scribes filed away tablets by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, preserving every aspect of Mesopotamian life and thought in wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay. When the excavators found these archive rooms, when they carefully removed tablet after tablet from the debris where they'd lain for millennia. They discovered something remarkable. The tablets weren't just religious texts or hymns to Enlil, though there were plenty of those. They were a complete library of Sumerian civilization. Mathematical texts with problems and solutions, astronomical observations tracking planetary movements across decades, medical prescriptions for treating various ailments, legal documents recording contracts and court decisions, school exercises where student scribes practiced their writing, and yes, mythological narratives, the stories of gods and heroes that would eventually influence literature throughout the ancient Near East and beyond. One particular room in the Eker complex, a chamber that archaeologists designated as Tablet House, contained what appeared to be a special collection, a curated archive of texts considered especially important or sacred. Among them were the earliest versions of many creation myths, flood narratives, and stories about the Anunnaki that would later be copied and recopied throughout Mesopotamia. These Nippur versions were older than most other surviving copies, presumably closer to whatever original sources the scribes were working from. And here's where it gets intriguing. Some of these tablets contain colophons, little notes added by the scribes who copied them, and these notes occasionally mention their sources, describing them as ancient texts or tablets from before the flood, or copies made from the original kept in the temple of /some god /. The scribes were aware that they were working with very old material, that they were links in a chain of transmission stretching back into a past they could barely comprehend, that they were preserving knowledge whose origins were lost in sacred antiquity. This sense of being inheritors rather than originators, of preserving rather than inventing, permeates Sumerian scribal culture. The educational system, the training that young scribes underwent in the tablet houses attached to temples, emphasized faithful copying, precise replication of older texts, maintenance of tradition. Innovation was not valued. What mattered was accuracy, continuity, the perfect preservation of knowledge received from previous generations, who received it from their predecessors in an unbroken line back to the gods themselves. What were they preserving? At the most basic level, they were maintaining the administrative and religious texts needed to keep civilization functioning, how to calculate field areas and irrigation schedules, how to predict lunar eclipses and planetary conjunctions, how to treat broken bones and fevers, how to conduct legal proceedings and enforce contracts, all the accumulated practical wisdom of a complex society. But there was something more, something the scribes seemed to recognize as fundamentally important, even when they couldn't fully explain it. They were preserving the memory of a time when things were different, when the gods walked on earth, when the Anunnaki governed directly, when knowledge flowed from heaven to earth without the mediation of human discovery and experimentation. They were maintaining a connection to the beginning, to the first times, to the sacred origins that legitimized everything that came after. In the quiet of these archive rooms, imagine the dust motes dancing in thin shafts of light from high windows. Imagine the smell of old clay and ancient ink. Imagine the profound silence broken only by the scratch of reed styluses on fresh tablets as scribes carefully copy texts. Can barely read, texts in dialects so archaic that special training is required to understand them, texts that must be preserved exactly as written, because to change even one sign might destroy some essential piece of wisdom. The scribes who worked in Nippur's tablet houses knew they were part of something larger than themselves, larger than their city, larger than their lifetime. They were participating in an act of cosmic preservation, maintaining the knowledge that the gods had granted to humanity at the beginning, ensuring that it would survive wars and floods and the slow erosion of time, that it would be passed on to future generations who might need it, who might finally understand what the ancients knew and what was lost and what might yet be recovered. Let your mind settle on that image for a while. Picture knowledge passed down, generation after generation, a thread that stretches back so far its origin blurs into myth. The Sumerians said it started with the gods, the Anunnaki, who showed up before anyone else and laid out the blueprint for civilization. Humans didn't invent this order, they inherited it. And whether those gods were real in the flesh, distant memories of old cultures, made-up faces for nature and society, or something we just can't describe, the Sumerians treated them as real. These gods handed down wisdom, and if people wanted civilization to last, they had to follow the rules exactly. The cities of the Anunnaki aren't really lost. Their bones are scattered all over southern Iraq. You can walk their ruins, read the excavation reports, trace the outlines of ancient streets. What's lost isn't the stones or the bricks, it's the meaning. We don't fully understand why these cities were built where they were, or what bigger idea tied it all together. We're missing the living connection to the system of knowledge the Sumerians believed they'd inherited from the divine. Sure, we have a lot. Foundations, broken walls, whole libraries of clay tablets, texts about gods, myths, prayers, daily business, even lists of kings and laws. The physical pieces of Sumerian life are everywhere. But the big picture, the way it all fit in the Sumerian mind, that's out of reach. We don't have their worldview, the framework that would unlock what these buildings and texts meant to them, how they saw the gods, how they thought heaven and earth worked together, how they felt about the past and their own uncertain present. We're looking in from the outside, separated from them by 5,000 years. Something vital gets lost in that long journey from then to now. Maybe that's just how it goes. Not every mystery needs solving. Sometimes the truth is unreachable, not because someone's hiding it, but because you need a context that's gone for good. The best we can do is come to these ruins with a bit of humility, admitting that the people who built them knew things we don't, lived in a world we can't quite reconstruct, belonged to a culture that made perfect sense to them but leaves us guessing. And now, as you get ready for sleep, let that be enough. Let go of the urge to have all the answers. Let the mysteries stay mysterious. Let the cities keep their secrets. They've waited for thousands of years. They can wait a little longer. These are the leftovers of a world where gods and humans walked the same streets and built things that were supposed to last forever. Rest in the quiet of not knowing. There's a kind of comfort in these ancient stones, in the silence of libraries no one visits but where wisdom still waits, pressed into clay, holding out for someone to understand. The Anunnaki are gone, whatever they were. The cities are still here. The questions haven't gone anywhere. And in that space between what we know and what we never will, there's room for wonder, for imagination, for the dreams that come when night is deep and the wall between past and present grows thin. Maybe for a moment, you'll almost touch that ancient world, almost hear voices echoing down old streets, almost see the faces of the gods who were said to have taught humans how to turn wilderness into civilization. Sleep easy. The cities will still be here when you wake up, and the day after, and on and on. Tonight, the stars move above you just like they did when Sumerian priests climbed their ziggurats and watched the sky. As you drift off, breathing slow and steady, let your thoughts wander with those old astronomers, looking up and wondering about the same lights, the same mysteries, the same endless sky. The night sky over ancient Mesopotamia would have been breathtaking its clarity unpolluted by the artificial glow of cities, unmarred by the haze of industrial civilization. On a moonless night, the Milky Way would have stretched across the vault of heaven like a river of light, and the planets would have shone with steady brilliance among the flickering stars. The Sumerians looked up at this celestial display not with the detached curiosity of modern amateur astronomers, but with profound attention, with the understanding that what happened in the heavens directly influenced what happened on Earth. They developed an astronomical knowledge system of remarkable sophistication, one that allowed them to predict eclipses, to track the movements of planets through the zodiac, to calculate with precision the length of the year and the month, and they did this according to their own texts because the gods had taught them, because the Anunnaki who established civilization had also revealed the secrets of the heavens, the patterns that governed time and destiny. When archaeologists began systematically studying Sumerian astronomical texts in the early 20th century, when scholars at the University of Chicago and other American institutions started translating the mathematical tables and observational records preserved on clay tablets, they discovered something that still generates quiet amazement in academic circles. The Sumerians possessed astronomical knowledge that should have required centuries of continuous observation to accumulate. Knowledge about cycles and patterns that only reveal themselves across generations of patient skywatching. They knew about the precession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble in Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to shift very gradually over thousands of years. This phenomenon wasn't rediscovered by Western astronomy until the Greek astronomer Hipparchus documented it in the 2nd century BCE, yet Sumerian texts from 1,000 years earlier incorporate precession into their calculations of long-term cycles. How did they know? Who observed the sky long enough, precisely enough to detect a change that takes over 25,000 years to complete a full cycle? The standard academic answer is that the Sumerians were extraordinary observers who maintained continuous astronomical records over many generations, passing down their accumulated data from teacher to student in an unbroken chain of knowledge transmission. This explanation is reasonable, plausible, probably even correct as far as it goes, but it doesn't quite account for the completeness of the knowledge, for the sophistication of the mathematics, for the precision of the measurements that appear so early in the historical record. The temple at Uruk dedicated to Inanna was aligned to track the movements of Venus with remarkable accuracy, the planet's cycle, its appearances as morning and evening star, its periodic disappearances when it passes too close to the sun to be visible. All of this was encoded in the temple's architecture and ritual calendar. Priests could predict when Venus would appear or vanish, could calculate years in advance the goddess's celestial manifestations. At the ziggurat of the moon god Nana was oriented to track lunar cycles, not just the simple monthly rhythm of new moon to full moon, but the more complex patterns of lunar eclipses and the slow drift of the lunar orbit. The Sumerians had worked out the Saros cycle, that 18-year pattern after which eclipses repeat in roughly the same sequence. This knowledge allowed them to predict eclipses with accuracy that must have seemed like magic to anyone who didn't understand the mathematical principles behind the predictions. Imagine the psychological impact of this astronomical mastery. Imagine being able to announce weeks or months in advance that on a specific night at a specific time, the moon would darken or the sun would be obscured, to populations who didn't understand the celestial mechanics, who saw eclipses as omens of divine displeasure or cosmic disorder. The ability to predict these events would have demonstrated a connection to divine knowledge, would have proven that the priests who made such predictions possessed secrets given to them by the gods themselves. And perhaps that's exactly what the priests believed. Perhaps they understood themselves not as clever observers who had figured out the patterns through long study, but as guardians of knowledge that had been revealed, knowledge that came from the Anunnaki who understood the heavens because they had traveled through them, who knew the movements of celestial bodies because they had observed them from perspectives humans couldn't access. The astronomical sophistication extended beyond prediction into meaning, into the belief that celestial events directly influenced earthly affairs. This wasn't primitive superstition. It was a systematic attempt to understand causation in a universe where the boundaries between physical and spiritual, between astronomical and astrological, hadn't yet been firmly established. The Sumerians watched the sky not just to mark time but to read fate, to understand divine intention, to glimpse the plans of the Anunnaki, written in the eternal movements of lights that predated human existence. Temple architecture across all the major Sumerian cities incorporated astronomical alignments with precision that required sophisticated surveying techniques and mathematical knowledge, corners oriented to cardinal directions with accuracy within a fraction of a degree, walls and doorways positioned to catch specific moments of sunrise or sunset. On solstice and equinox days, internal chambers arranged to channel light in ways that mark the passage of seasons and years. These weren't accidental features, they were deliberate design elements, incorporated into the temples because the buildings were understood as cosmic instruments, as tools for maintaining the proper relationship between earth and heaven. The temple functioned as an observatory, yes, but also as something more, as a bridge between realms, as a mechanism for keeping the earthly realm synchronized with celestial time, with the divine order that governed all existence. Let your breathing slow even more now, matching the vast calm of stellar movements, the patient turning of the cosmos that knows no hurry, no anxiety, only the eternal unfolding of patterns established at creation. Feel yourself becoming part of that cosmic rhythm, your heartbeat echoing the pulse of time itself, your thoughts drifting like planets through the dark spaces between awareness and sleep. Temple inventories from Sumerian sites throw us a curveball. Instead of confirming what we think we know about ancient technology, they hint at things that don't fit our tidy picture of the past. These lists were straightforward on the surface, just records of what sat in temple storerooms, everything technically property of the gods, managed by priests. Most of what they list is exactly what you'd expect: statues, jewelry, expensive clothes, ritual tools, the usual stuff. But then, out of nowhere, you get these weird descriptions. Objects that translators have trouble pinning down, things that seem to defy what we think those people could make or use. Take the stones that give off light. Not some poetic divine glow, but practical actual light. The texts talk about stones that lit up temple rooms on their own, no wick, no oil, just steady illumination. They didn't need tending. They didn't make smoke or smell. They just worked. Most modern scholars wave this off as mythology. They chalk it up to metaphor, a symbol for wisdom or enlightenment, not a real artifact. That's the safe bet. It keeps everything within the realm of what we already accept about Sumerian technology. But what if there's more to it? Let's play with the idea for a second. Maybe these texts remember real glowing objects, maybe not electric lights or anything wild like that, but minerals or mixes that naturally glow in the dark. Some stones actually do glow after they soak up sunlight. Maybe the Sumerians or people before them figured this out and used it for temple lighting, especially in places where a constantly burning flame mattered for rituals. The science for this isn't out of reach for the ancient world. Certain minerals or chemical mixes, phosphorus compounds for example, can glow for hours. It's possible that knowledge about these materials may be passed down from earlier civilizations, was guarded by temple priests like some kind of sacred recipe. So those stones that emit light might have been real objects, not just poetic symbols. There's more. Some inventories mention objects that make sound on their own, singing, humming, resonating, but not in the way a harp or a flute works. Maybe it's all symbolic, the voice of a god or the music of the heavens. But maybe it's not. Maybe these records remember acoustic tricks, an understanding of resonance and vibration that let people build things that sang when the wind blew or when water moved through them. Researchers have checked out the acoustics of some Sumerian temple chambers with modern gear. Turns out, these spaces weren't just stone boxes. They amplify certain frequencies, dampen others. In some spots, you get standing waves. The buildings themselves act like instruments, creating effects that would have seemed magical to anyone who didn't know the physics behind them. So what if those singing stones weren't just fancy rocks, but carefully designed architectural elements? What if ancient builders knew how to tune spaces and objects to create sound effects that matched the mysterious descriptions in these old lists? It wouldn't be magic. It would be science, just a kind of science we're only now starting to notice in the dust of ancient temples. The descriptions of divine weapons present similar interpretive challenges. The texts describe the gods, particularly warrior deities, like Nippur, as possessing weapons that could destroy at a distance, that could bring down walls or strike multiple enemies simultaneously, that produced effects more devastating than conventional Bronze Age weaponry. Academic interpretation treats these as mythological exaggeration, as symbolic representations of divine power expressed through metaphorical weapons that exceed human capabilities. But again, there's room to wonder whether these descriptions preserve distorted memories of actual advanced weapon systems, not ray guns or nuclear devices, nothing so anachronistic but perhaps sophisticated understanding of chemistry applied to warfare or advanced metallurgy that produced superior bronze alloys, or engineering knowledge that enabled the construction of powerful siege weapons, technologies that were revolutionary in their context, that gave their possessors decisive military advantages, and that later generations remembered as divine weapons because they couldn't replicate them. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, now in the Louvre Museum, depicts the Akkadian king who ruled around 2250 BCE, carrying what the inscription describes as a divine weapon given to him by the gods. The object depicted on the stele doesn't look like any known ancient weapon. It's described in the text as having properties that allowed Naram-Sin to defeat enemies who otherwise would have been invincible. The academic interpretation is that this represents royal propaganda, symbolic expression of divine favor, rather than description of an actual unusual weapon. But what if we take the text at face value? What if Naram-Sin did possess some weapon that gave him significant military advantage, some technology preserved from earlier times, some device that worked on principles his enemies didn't understand and therefore seemed supernatural? The victory it enabled would be attributed to divine intervention because that was the only explanatory framework available. But the object itself might have been real, might have been an actual artifact from the temple arsenals where ancient technologies were preserved and occasionally deployed. These questions can't be answered definitively with the evidence currently available. The objects themselves, if they ever existed as physical artifacts rather than mythological concepts, have long since disappeared. What survives are the descriptions, tantalizing and ambiguous, suggesting capabilities that seem impossible for Bronze Age civilization, but not necessarily impossible for a hypothetical earlier culture with different technological pathways, different areas of expertise, different solutions to practical problems. As your mind drifts further now, as the questions dissolve into the comfortable fog of approaching sleep, Let yourself imagine those temple storerooms one more time. Imagine shelves holding objects we can know, longer identify, technologies we can't reconstruct, tools and devices whose functions are lost but whose descriptions survive in fragmentary form on clay tablets that hint at knowledge we haven't recovered, at capabilities we haven't yet regained. The Persian Gulf hides secrets no one's likely to dig up, not with all that salt water and layers of ancient mud. The Tigris and Euphrates have dumped silt here for thousands of years, and whatever's beneath is locked away maybe forever. Still, the idea nags at archaeologists, the thought that under those waves there could be the bones of cities older than history, places that stood before the flood, back when the Gulf was just a green valley and not a stretch of sea. Picture the world 20,000 years ago at the peak of the last ice age. Sea levels were about 400 feet lower than now. Huge glaciers sucked up so much water that entire coastlines stood exposed. Land that's underwater today was dry ground, plenty of room for people to settle. No doubt they did. If you'd visited the Persian Gulf back then, you wouldn't have seen water. You'd have walked a river valley where the Tigris and Euphrates joined forces and wandered down toward the Gulf of Oman. It would have been lush, the kind of place you pick if you wanted to plant crops or build a home. Sheltered, watered, low and safe from the desert winds, it was prime land for anyone looking to put down roots, maybe even start inventing civilization. But the Ice Age didn't last. As the world warmed, glaciers melted. At first, the seas crept up slowly. Then, when massive ice dams burst, the water rose in terrifying leaps. Imagine living on the coast and watching the ocean swallow the land year after year. Sometimes even within a single lifetime, the shoreline would vanish. People had to run for higher ground or die trying. Around 14,000 years ago, the Persian Gulf started to fill. The water pushed upriver, flooding the valley, little by little covering whatever farms or villages were there. By 6000 BCE, the transformation was complete. The Gulf looked much as it does now, and the old valley disappeared under as much as 200 feet of water and mud. If there were people there, their houses, tools, and everything else are buried deep, out of reach. Some scholars think this flood, the one that drowned the Persian Gulf, might be the real story behind the Sumerian flood myths. The timing adds up. Just as the last of the valley disappeared, early towns popped up in southern Mesopotamia. Suddenly, you see the beginnings of Sumerian culture. Imagine the people from the drowned valley scrambling into what's now Iraq, carrying with them whatever they could save, their skills, their stories, and maybe a few seeds. Maybe they built the first cities like Eridu, using knowledge they'd already worked out in the Lost Valley. That would explain why these early settlements seem to appear out of nowhere, already knowing how to irrigate fields or build complex structures. This idea answers a lot of questions about the Sumerians. Why do they seem so obsessed with water? Why do they tell stories of a great flood that wiped everything out? Why does it feel like their civilization just arrived, fully formed, as if someone handed it to them? Their texts always say civilization was a gift from the gods, not something people invented. But maybe those gods were just the memory of the people who came before. The survivors told stories about them, passing down their knowledge, until the tales grew grander with each generation. Eventually, those lost ancestors turned into legends, their skills became miracles, and the vanished cities became the work of the divine Anunnaki. Not ordinary folks who once called the Gulf Valley home. Underwater archaeology in the Persian Gulf is extraordinarily difficult. Due to depth, visibility issues, strong currents, and the thick sediment that covers the sea floor, some survey work has been attempted using side-scan sonar and other remote sensing technologies to search for anomalous features that might indicate human structures, a few promising. Sites have been identified, underwater features that have regular geometries suggesting possible architectural remains, but no systematic excavation has been possible, and no definitive evidence has emerged. The political situation in the region hasn't helped. The Persian Gulf is one of the world's most geopolitically sensitive areas, surrounded by countries with complex relationships and conflicting interests. International archaeological expeditions face significant obstacles in obtaining permissions, securing funding, and maintaining long-term research programs. The scientific questions take a back seat to security concerns and political considerations. So the question remains open, frustratingly unresolved. Are there lost cities beneath the Persian Gulf, settlements that represent the origin point of Mesopotamian civilization, the source of the knowledge that the Sumerians attributed to divine teaching? Or is the underwater landscape as featureless as the sediment-covered seafloor suggests, empty of human remains, evidence that the Gulf Valley was never significantly occupied during the Ice Age? We may never know for certain, at least not with current technology and current political realities, but the possibility lingers, hovering at the edge of plausibility, suggesting that the Sumerian flood narratives might preserve genuine historical memory of catastrophe and displacement, that the cities we have excavated might indeed be reconstructions of something older, that the knowledge systems that appear so suddenly in the archaeological record might have been transmitted from somewhere else, from something that came before. Feel the gentle pull of sleep now, the irresistible drift toward unconsciousness that mirrors the slow subsidence of land beneath rising waters, the gradual submersion of the past beneath layers of time and forgetting. Let yourself sink like a drowned city down into the dark depths where memories dissolve and reform into dreams, where the boundaries between what was and what might have been grow soft and permeable. There's one more city we must visit before this journey ends, one more site that holds clues to the mystery of the Anunnaki and their lost cities. Kish lies north of Babylon, closer to the later cultural heartland of Mesopotamia than the deep southern cities we've been exploring. Archaeological excavations here in the early 20th century revealed something that connects all the threads we've been following. Evidence of catastrophic flooding, remarkably sophisticated architecture appearing very early in the historical record, and textual references to Kish as the first seat of kingship after the deluge. The Sumerian king list, that extraordinary document we discussed in part 1, specifies that after the flood swept over the earth, kingship descended from heaven a second time, and this time it was established at Kish rather than Eridu. The shift in location is significant, suggesting either a political change or perhaps a geographical change in the most suitable location for a major settlement after the flood had altered the landscape. Excavations at Kish revealed the same type of sterile flood deposit found at and other sites, a thick layer of clean silt dated to around 2900 BCE, separating earlier occupation levels from later rebuilding. But Kish also revealed something else, something that American archaeologists from the University of Chicago documented with careful attention to stratigraphic detail, evidence of remarkably sophisticated urban planning in the layers immediately following the flood deposit. The post-flood city was laid out according to a grid plan with streets intersecting at right angles, with residential districts separated from religious and administrative areas, with sophisticated drainage systems that channeled waste water away from living spaces. This level of urban planning appearing so early, immediately after a catastrophic flood, suggests that the builders weren't starting from scratch, weren't experimenting their way toward effective city design. They were implementing knowledge they already possessed, following principles they had learned from somewhere or someone. The temples at Kish showed the same pattern we've seen elsewhere. Precise astronomical alignments, sophisticated architectural techniques, construction following sacred geometries that would be maintained through multiple rebuildings across millennia, and the texts found at Kish, fragmentary and damaged though many of them are, speak of the city's special role in the post-flood world, of kings who received legitimacy directly from the gods, of divine instruction in rebuilding civilization according to the patterns that had existed before. One particularly intriguing text from Kish describes a ritual in which the king ascended to the roof of the highest temple at midnight and observed the stars, noting their positions and comparing them to records maintained by the priests. The ritual was performed on specific nights throughout the year, creating an ongoing astronomical log that allowed the tracking of long-term celestial cycles. The text specifies that this practice was instituted by divine command, that the gods had instructed humans to maintain continuous skywatching because the movements of the heavens governed the unfolding of time and destiny. Why this obsessive attention to astronomical observation? Why did every major Sumerian city invest such enormous resources in maintaining priestly astronomers who spent their nights watching the sky and their days calculating and recording the movements of celestial bodies? The practical applications of astronomy for agricultural timing and calendar keeping don't fully explain the intensity of the effort or the sophistication of the knowledge accumulated. Perhaps the answer lies in the texts themselves, in the repeated statements that the gods would return, that the Anunnaki who had departed after establishing civilization would someday come back, and that their return would be signaled by specific celestial events, by conjunctions and alignments that could be predicted if the astronomical records were maintained with sufficient accuracy. The priests watched the sky not just to mark the passage of seasons, but to watch for signs of divine return, to be ready when the boundary between heaven and earth became permeable again, when the gods descended to judge what humanity had made of the civilization they had been given. This is, of course, theological belief rather than astronomical science in our modern understanding of the distinction, but to the Sumerians, the two were inseparable, part of the same integrated worldview in which celestial mechanics and divine intention were aspects of a single cosmic order that governed all existence. As your consciousness dims now, as the last threads of waking awareness dissolve into the formless potential of sleep, let your mind release its grip on questions and answers, on evidence and interpretation, on the need to know and understand and explain. Let yourself simply drift through these ancient cities like a ghost, observing without being observed, moving through temples and archive rooms and astronomical observatories that exist now only in memory and ruins, monuments to human wonder and divine mystery, to knowledge gained and lost and partially recovered, to questions that have no final answers but infinite paths of exploration. The Anunnaki, whoever or whatever they were, have left their mark on these cities, on the texts and traditions that survived the flood and the millennia that followed, whether they were gods in the literal sense, beings from beyond Earth who taught humans the arts of civilization, or whether they represent something else, cultural memory of an earlier human culture, personifications of natural forces and social institutions, mythological explanations for knowledge whose origins were already lost when the first tablets were written. They remain present in the ruins, in the astronomical alignments, in the temple inventories describing objects we can no longer identify, in the flood narratives that speak of catastrophe and survival and knowledge preserved against overwhelming odds. The lost cities of the Anunnaki are not truly lost. They're here, beneath the sand and dust of 5,000 years, mapped and excavated, and studied by generations of archaeologists who have dedicated their lives to understanding what these ancient people built and why, and according to what principles. What's lost is not the cities themselves, but the complete context that would allow us to understand them as their builders understood them, to see through their eyes, to share their worldview in which gods and humans move through the same streets and work toward the same cosmic purposes. Perhaps that loss is irretrievable. Perhaps no amount of excavation or textual analysis will restore what time and cultural change have erased. But in the attempt to understand, in the patient work of archaeology and translation and interpretation, in the questions we ask and the wonder we feel when confronting mysteries that resist easy answers, we participate in something the Sumerians would have recognized and approved: the human drive to connect with what came before, to maintain the chain of memory and knowledge that links us to our deepest past, to preserve what can be preserved even when complete understanding eludes us. Sleep now in the peace of these ancient stones, in the silence of temples where no prayers echo anymore, in the darkness of cities that have seen sunset and sunrise for 5,000 years and will see them for 5,000 more. The Anunnaki, whether gods or memories or something beyond either category, have fulfilled their purpose. They established civilization, taught humans what they needed to know to transform wilderness into gardens and cities, and departed into the silence from which they came. What remains is enough: the cities themselves, testimony to human achievement and divine mystery, monuments to the eternal questions about where we came from and why we're here, and what knowledge might still lie buried, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to ask the right questions, to understand at last what was really built here in the dawn of civilization, when the gods walked on earth and anything seemed possible. Rest now, the cities endure, the mysteries remain, and in the space between knowing and unknowing, between waking and sleeping, between the past and the present that is always becoming past, there is peace, there is wonder, and there are dreams of ancient glories waiting to be remembered when morning comes. As we approach the end of our journey through these ancient cities, as sleep draws nearer, and the boundary between waking and dreaming grows thin and permeable, let's pause for a moment in the quiet darkness and consider what we've discovered, what remains mysterious, and what these ruins tell us about the eternal human quest to understand our origins. The sun is setting now over the desert of southern Iraq, casting long shadows across tall mounds that mark where cities once thrived. Light turns golden, then amber, then fades to purple as darkness claims the landscape. In this transitional hour, in this liminal space between day and night, between the ancient past and the uncertain present, we can almost feel the presence of those who came before, the builders and priests and astronomers who dedicated their lives to maintaining connections between earth and heaven, between human understanding and divine mystery. Modern archaeology has given us remarkable insights into Sumerian civilization, into the material culture and social organization and technological achievements of these ancient people who invented writing and built the first cities and developed mathematics and astronomy to levels that would not be surpassed for thousands of years. We can walk through the ruins they left behind, touch the walls they built, read the texts they wrote, and through these tangible connections we can know them in ways that would have been impossible just 2 centuries ago. But for all that we've learned, for all the tablets that have been translated and the sites that have been excavated, there remain profound Mysteries at the heart of Sumerian civilization, questions that no amount of archaeological investigation seems able to fully answer. The suddenness of their emergence, the completeness of their knowledge, the precision of their astronomical observations, the sophistication of their urban planning, all of this appeared with a rapidity that continues to puzzle researchers who study the deep past. The conventional explanation, the one that most archaeologists would offer if pressed to account for these puzzling features, is that we simply haven't found the developmental stages yet, that somewhere there must be earlier sites showing the gradual evolution from simple farming villages to complex urban civilization, and that future excavations will eventually fill in the gaps in our understanding. This is a reasonable position, grounded in the principle that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that archaeological discovery is an ongoing process, and that patience and continued research will eventually resolve apparent anomalies. And there's genuine merit to this perspective. Archaeological work in Iraq and surrounding regions has been severely limited by political instability, by wars and conflicts that have made systematic investigation impossible for long periods. Large areas of Mesopotamia remain unexcavated, their secrets still buried beneath the sand. The water table in many areas has risen significantly since ancient times, making excavation of the deepest and therefore oldest layers extraordinarily difficult. Climate change, both ancient and modern, has altered the landscape in ways that make it hard to identify promising sites. American and European institutions that once maintained active excavation programs in Iraq have been unable to work there consistently. For decades now, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, which housed many of the most important discoveries from early excavations, was looted in 2003. During the chaos following the invasion, and thousands of artifacts were lost or destroyed, the institutional knowledge, the accumulated expertise of generations of Iraqi archaeologists has been severely disrupted by conflict and displacement. So it's entirely possible that the missing pieces of the Sumerian puzzle still lie beneath the desert, waiting for circumstances to improve, waiting for archaeologists to return with modern techniques and new questions, waiting to tell their stories and fill the gaps that currently make Sumerian civilization seem so inexplicably sophisticated, so early in its development. But there's another possibility, one that doesn't require abandoning scientific rigor or embracing fringe theories, one that takes seriously what the Sumerians themselves believed about their civilization's origins. Perhaps the knowledge really was transmitted rather than independently developed. Perhaps the Sumerians really were inheritors of a tradition that originated elsewhere, with an earlier culture that was disrupted or destroyed by the environmental catastrophes at the end of the last ice age. This interpretation doesn't require invoking extraterrestrials or lost supercivilizations with impossible technologies. It simply suggests that human cultural development followed a more complex path than we usually imagine, that knowledge accumulated in certain favorable locations during the Ice Age, and that when rising sea levels and climate change disrupted these early centers of development, the survivors carried what they could to new locations and began the process of reconstruction. The Persian Gulf Valley, dry and fertile during the Ice Age, would have been an ideal location for early agricultural experimentation and settlement development, if populations there achieved significant cultural sophistication over thousands of years, and if that valley was then gradually flooded as sea levels rose. The displaced populations would naturally have moved to the nearest suitable highland, which would have been southern Mesopotamia. They would have brought with them whatever they could carry: seed, stocks, domesticated animals, tool-making techniques, astronomical knowledge accumulated through generations of observation, architectural principles learned through trial and error over centuries, and they would have tried to recreate what they had lost, building new cities according to remembered patterns, preserving knowledge through tradition, and eventually through the writing system they developed to ensure that nothing more would be forgotten. In this reading, the Anunnaki represent cultural memory of these earlier populations, elevated to divine status through generations of mythological elaboration, credited with supernatural powers because their achievements seemed impossible to recreate, remembered as gods, because the distance of time and the trauma of displacement had erased the full context that would have revealed them as human. This interpretation explains many of the puzzling features we've discussed, the sophistication appearing without local developmental stages, the flood narratives with their specific details about catastrophe and survival, the orientation toward restoration and preservation rather than innovation, the texts that insist civilization was given by the gods rather than invented by humans. It explains these things without requiring us to abandon scientific principles or archaeological methodology. But here's the thing, and this is important as you feel yourself sinking deeper now into rest, deeper into that space where certainty dissolves and wonder remains. It doesn't really matter whether this interpretation is correct in every detail. What matters is what the Sumerian cities and texts reveal about human nature, about our deep need to connect with what came before us, about the ways we preserve and transmit knowledge across generations, about how we understand our place in the vast sweep of time. The Sumerians didn't just build cities, they built with forever in mind. Sure, they used mud brick because that's what they had. They knew perfectly well that mud brick melts back into the earth unless someone's always patching it up. Still, they kept building and they didn't think small. Their ziggurats soared high enough to catch your eye from miles away, monuments meant to shout across the ages about who they were and what they'd done, long after the people themselves had turned to dust. And it worked. 5,000 years on, we still talk about them. We're still digging up their old cities, reading their words, shaking our heads at what they managed to pull off. The kings and priests, the scribes, they're mostly nameless now. A few names survive in tablets, but the rest are lost. What stuck around is the civilization itself, that shared project they all built together. That's what lasted. This is just what people do. We build for more than just ourselves. We put up buildings, write books, set up systems, stuff meant to outlive us by centuries, sometimes millennia. We get it deep down. We're just one link in an endless chain, stretching back to ancestors we can't even picture, rolling forward into a future we can barely imagine. Everything we know, everything we make, it all stands on what those before us left behind. And we keep going, hoping the next folks will do the same with what we leave. The Sumerians wrapped that idea in myth. Their stories tell of gods who set up civilization, then left humans to care for it. These days, maybe we talk about culture and knowledge instead of gods, but the heart of it is the same. Most of what we have was handed down. We don't invent as much as we inherit. Our job is to take care of what's been given, to pass it on, hopefully improved, but at least not ruined. So when people argue about whether the Anunnaki were real beings or just stories, it almost misses the point. The stories matter because of what they say. The Sumerians didn't see themselves as the inventors of civilization, but as caretakers. They held on to knowledge from earlier times. Their biggest responsibility wasn't to make everything new, but to keep things going and hand it forward. There's something huge in that. These days we're obsessed with progress, with change for its own sake. Maybe we should pause and look back. Not everything old has to be thrown out. Not every tradition needs a rational explanation to be worth keeping. Sometimes just holding on is valuable, keeping a thread to the past, even when we're not sure why it matters. Think about those priests, tracking the stars long after anyone remembered why it was so important. Or the temples, rebuilt in the same spot, lined up to the same points on the compass, even after the original reasons were lost. Or the scribes, copying texts over and over, saving knowledge whose purpose was forgotten but whose value still lingered. And because they did all that, because they stuck with it instead of chasing the new for the sake of new, we can reach back and touch their world. If the Sumerians had been quick to update or toss out old ways, most of what they knew would have vanished. It's their stubbornness, their loyalty to tradition, that kept their civilization alive for us to find. So now just breathe a little slower. Let your body sink into the ground beneath you. Let your mind drop the constant urge to explain and analyze. Just sit quietly with these ancient stones, these monuments that still stand, a testament to human longing and mystery, and the hope that something we build might last. American archaeologists working in Iraq throughout the 20th century made countless discoveries that expanded our understanding of Sumerian civilization, but they also documented how much remains unknown. How? Many questions lack definitive answers. The University of Pennsylvania's excavations at Nippur, the Oriental Institute's work at multiple sites, the collaborative projects that brought together researchers from different institutions and different countries, all of this work revealed the complexity and sophistication of ancient Mesopotamia while also highlighting the limits of what archaeology can tell us. We can excavate buildings and analyze pottery and translate texts, but we can't fully recover the lived experience of the people who created them. We can't know what it felt like to be a Sumerian priest climbing the ziggurat at midnight to observe the stars, what thoughts ran through their minds, what emotions filled their hearts, what sense of connection to the divine or the cosmic order shaped their understanding of what they were doing. We can read descriptions of rituals, but we can't know what the participants experienced during those rituals, whether they felt genuine divine presence or performed out of social obligation or fell somewhere in between belief and skepticism. We can study the astronomical texts and confirm the accuracy of the observations, but we can't fully understand the integration of scientific observation and religious meaning that characterize Sumerian astronomy. These limitations aren't failures of archaeological method. They're inherent in the nature of studying the past. We're separated from the Sumerians by 5,000 years of cultural change, by the unbridgeable gap between their worldview and ours, by the simple fact that they're dead and can't tell us what they meant, what they believed, what they experienced as they lived their lives and built their cities and watched their civilizations rise and fall. But within these limitations, within the constraints of what evidence survives and what methods we have for interpreting it, archaeology has given us something precious, a connection to the deep past, a sense of continuity with the first civilizations, an appreciation for how long humans have been asking the fundamental questions about our origins and our purpose and our relationship to the cosmos. The Sumerians looked at the stars and wondered. They built monuments that reached toward heaven and wondered whether gods noticed, whether divine beings cared about human achievements, whether the boundary between earth and sky might someday become permeable again. They preserved texts about the Anunnaki, about divine beings who had established civilization and then departed, and they wondered whether those beings would return, whether humanity would be judged worthy of what it had been given, whether the knowledge could be maintained across the generations until the time of return. We look at Sumerian ruins and wonder, We read their texts about the Anunnaki and wonder who these beings really were, whether the stories preserve historical memories or mythological inventions, whether ancient people knew things we've forgotten, whether civilizations rise and fall in cycles that stretch across time scales we can barely comprehend. We preserve their tablets in climate-controlled museums and wonder what future archaeologists will make of our own civilization, what they'll think when they excavate our cities 5,000 years from now, what stories they'll tell about us. The wondering continues, the questions endure, and in the space between what we know and what we can never know, there is room for imagination, for speculation, for the kind of deep thinking that happens in the quiet hours before sleep, when the rational mind relaxes its grip and allows deeper patterns to emerge. So what should we conclude about the Anunnaki, about these mysterious beings who occupy such a central place in Sumerian mythology and in modern speculation about ancient astronauts and lost civilizations? The answer, if we're being honest, is that we don't know and probably can't know with the evidence currently available. They might have been purely mythological constructs, symbolic representations of natural forces or social institutions, imaginary beings created to explain the unexplainable and legitimize the existing social order. This is the mainstream academic position, and it's grounded in sound reasoning and careful analysis of the evidence. But they might also have been cultural memories of real human populations from an earlier time, people who achieved significant cultural sophistication before the end of the Ice Age and whose displaced survivors established Sumerian civilization. The knowledge and techniques they brought with them would have seemed like divine gifts to populations who didn't have them, and over generations of retelling, the human sources would naturally be elevated to superhuman status, transformed into gods. Or perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. Perhaps the Anunnaki represent something more complex than either pure myth or distorted historical memory. Perhaps they embody the Sumerian understanding of how knowledge comes into the world, how civilization emerges, how humans relate to forces and principles that transcend individual lives and individual generations. What we can say with confidence is that the Sumerians took them seriously, built their civilization around the belief that they were real, structured their society according to principles they attributed to Anunnaki teaching, maintained practices and preserved knowledge they believed had been given by these divine beings. Whether the Anunnaki existed in literal physical form or only in cultural memory and religious imagination, they shaped Sumerian civilization as profoundly as any material cause. And perhaps that's the real lesson here, as your consciousness dims further, as sleep claims you and the questions dissolve into dreams. Beliefs shape reality. The stories we tell about our origins influence how we understand ourselves, how we organize our societies, what we consider important enough to preserve and transmit to future generations. The Sumerians believed they were custodians of divine knowledge, and that belief led them to preserve that knowledge with extraordinary dedication across thousands of years. We believe we're the creators of our own civilization, the inventors and innovators who push the boundaries of what's possible, and that belief shapes how we approach the future, how we value progress and change and constant improvement. Neither belief is simply true or false. Both are frameworks for understanding human experience, lenses through which we interpret the past and imagine the future. The Sumerian framework emphasized preservation, continuity, maintenance of sacred patterns established at the beginning. Our framework emphasizes transformation, innovation, the constant creation of the new. Each has its strengths and weaknesses, its insights and blind spots. Perhaps the wisdom lies in holding both perspectives simultaneously, recognizing that we are both inheritors and creators, both preservers and innovators, both bound by what came before and free to imagine what might come next. The cities still stand. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Kish, those old Sumerian sites where they built their temples, wrote down their wisdom, and traced the patterns of the stars. They're still out there on the plains of southern Iraq, half buried, half exposed, stubbornly holding on to secrets that haven't been dug up yet. Layers below the surface hide questions no one's answered, mysteries that probably won't ever get a neat solution. Tomorrow and the day after and long after that, they'll still be there, watching in their way as civilizations rise and fall, as people keep searching for meaning and connection and some kind of understanding. Archaeologists will keep digging, using new tools and clever tricks to pull more stories from the ruins. Scholars will keep poring over those old tablets, trying to get a little closer to what the Sumerians were really saying. With each new discovery, a few more pieces slot into place. The picture sharpens, but some parts just stay stubbornly out of reach. But for now, right now, as you drift in that soft, blurry space between awake and asleep, forget about finding every answer. Let the mysteries be mysterious. Let the Anunnaki stay undefined, whatever they were, gods, ancestors, symbols, or something stranger. Let the old cities keep guarding their secrets, at least for tonight. What matters is this feeling of peace settling over you. The comfort that comes from letting go, from having traveled so far in your mind, to places most people never even think about, asking questions that rarely get asked, wondering about the deep past and how it connects to your own life. Feel yourself sinking, really sinking, not just into your bed but through everything beneath you, down through the floor, the foundations, the packed earth, the layers of rock that hold the memory of endless years, all the way to the ancient stone that was here before anything lived, down to the fiery heart of the planet where pressure and heat work their slow magic. Then slowly start to float up again. Rise gentle and easy back through those layers, rock, earth, stone, up through the floor, back to where your body rests. But don't come all the way back. Hang out in that in-between place where boundaries blur, where past and present mix together, where if you listen just right, you might almost hear the Sumerians chanting in languages no one speaks anymore. Picture yourself lying inside a temple at Eridu, in a quiet room where priests sleep after the evening rituals. The walls are thick, cool mud brick. The air feels calm. Somewhere outside, a dog barks. Far off, a donkey calls. The moon climbs above the marshes and spills silver light through a high window. In that glow, you catch hints of those who came before. A long line of priests, scribes, worshippers passing through this same space for 3,000 years, all of them asking the same questions you're asking, all of them wondering about the gods, the stars, and what any of it means. They didn't find the final answers either. They lived their lives, did their work, honored their traditions, and then, like everyone, slipped into the silence that waits for us all. What they left behind, their cities, their writings, their questions, is a gift for whoever comes after, for us. For you, right now, lying here with 5,000-year-old mysteries on your mind, still fresh as morning dew. That's the real gift: continuity, connection, the knowledge that people have always asked, always built, always reached for the sky, always made up stories about gods and beginnings, always tried to figure out where we come from and why we're here and what waits beyond. The Sumerians are gone, but they're not really gone. They live in their ruins, in their words, in the questions we ask when we stand where they stood and stare up at the same stars, wondering if someone else is out there, building their own cities, asking their own questions, leaving their own marks on the endless mystery of time. As you approach the deepest part of sleep now, as consciousness releases its final hold and dreams begin to form in the darkness, let yourself imagine one last scene. Imagine standing on the summit of the great, Ziggurat at Ur at dawn, looking out across the desert as the sun breaks the horizon and floods the world with light. The city spreads below you, its walls and streets and houses catching the first rays, coming alive with color and detail after the monochrome of night. In the distance, other cities mark the landscape, other ziggurats rising from the plain like mountains made by human hands. Somewhere out there is Uruk, and Eridu and Lagash and Nippur and all the sacred sites where priests are performing the same morning rituals, welcoming the sun god Udu as he begins his daily journey across the sky. You are a priest who has spent the night observing the stars, tracking the movements of planets, recording your observations on clay tablets that will be filed away in the temple archives for future generations to consult. You are tired but satisfied, fulfilled by the sense of participating in something larger than yourself, something that stretches back to the beginning and forward to the end of time. You know that the gods established these practices, that the Anunnaki taught humans how to watch the sky and record what they saw, that this knowledge is sacred and must be preserved exactly as it was given. You don't question why the observations matter or what they're ultimately for. You trust that the gods know that when the time comes, when the cycle completes itself and the Anunnaki return, the records you've maintained will serve their purpose. The sun rises higher, the day begins, life continues as it has for thousands of years and will for thousands more. The cities stand, the temples function, the knowledge is preserved, and somewhere in the distant future, people you can't imagine will stand where you're standing, will read the texts you wrote, will wonder about the gods you served and the beliefs that gave your life meaning. They will ask questions you never thought to ask. They will know things you couldn't imagine. They will have technologies that would seem like magic to you, but they will also wonder, just as you wonder, about the deepest mysteries, about where humans came from and where we're going, about whether we're alone in the universe or whether others watch us from the darkness between the stars. The wondering continues, the questions endure, the cycle turns, and in the turning, in the endless dance of civilizations rising and falling, of knowledge gained and lost and rediscovered, of humans forever reaching toward something beyond themselves, there is meaning, there is purpose, there is the comfort of knowing that we're part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. Rest now, sleep deeply, dream peacefully. The ancient cities will still be there when you wake, still holding their secrets, still waiting patiently for the next seeker who comes with questions and wonder and the desire to connect with those who came before. The Anunnaki, whoever they were, have fulfilled their purpose. They established civilization, or humanity remembered them as having established it, and the memory served its function, preserving knowledge and practices across generations, maintaining continuity through catastrophes and cultural upheavals, ensuring that what was learned would not be entirely lost. And now that responsibility passes to you and to everyone who reads these texts and visits these ruins and asks these questions. We are all custodians now of the deep past, all preservers of ancient wisdom, all links in the chain that connects the first city to whatever cities will exist 5,000 years from now. Carry that responsibility lightly, hold the questions gently, wonder freely, and when wonder leads to sleep, let sleep come as naturally as night follows day, as inevitably as the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, as peacefully as the silence that fills these ancient cities when the tourists leave and the archaeologists pack up their tools and the desert wind is the only voice speaking in the darkness. The cities wait, the mysteries endure, and you, dear traveler, through time and space you have earned your rest. You have journeyed far tonight through 5,000 years of history, through the deepest questions humans have ever asked, through ruins and texts and possibilities that stretch the boundaries of what we think we know. Now let it all go. Let the questions dissolve, let the cities fade, let the Anunnaki recede into whatever realm they inhabit, whether historical, memory, or mythological imagination, or something beyond either category. Let your mind empty like the desert sky at midnight, vast and clear and full of stars but empty of everything else, peaceful in its emptiness, content in its vastness. Sleep comes like the tide, inevitable and gentle, washing over consciousness, erasing the day's sharp edges, smoothing everything into the soft darkness where all questions are suspended and all mysteries are simply mysteries, neither solved nor unsolvable, just present, just here, just part of the infinite wonder of existence itself. The last thing you hear before sleep claims you completely is the wind. Across the desert, the eternal wind that blew across these plains when the first cities were built and will blow long after the last ruins have crumbled back to dust, the wind that connects all moments in time, all seekers of truth, all dreamers of dreams, the wind that whispers ancient secrets in a language older than words, telling stories that begin before memory and end beyond imagination. Listen to the wind, let it carry you, let it hold you, let it deliver you safely into sleep and dreams, and the deep rest that restores all things. The journey is complete, the cities have been visited, the Anunnaki have been contemplated, the mysteries remain mysterious, which is as it should be, which is perfect, which is exactly right. Rest now, rest deeply, rest peacefully, rest completely. The ancient world has shared its secrets, or as many as it will share. The rest must remain silent, must remain buried, must remain part of the endless mystery that makes life worth living and wonder worth wondering. Good night, traveler, good night, seeker, good night, dreamer. May your sleep be as peaceful as desert nights under eternal stars. May your dreams be as vast as the questions we've explored. May you wake refreshed, renewed, and ready to carry forward the ancient task of wondering, questioning, and preserving the memory of all who came before. The cities endure, the questions remain, the wonder never ends. Sleep well,